All right, well, I didn't expect to wake up to news that a senior Russian official was killed in Moscow by an IED, but that's what we have, so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to dive into what we know so far about that event, as well as what might be some of the first footage showing North Korean troops fighting and dying in Ukraine, as well as some Russian rumors of Ukrainian counteroffensive that might be coming together. But diving into this assassination, targeted killing, or from a Russian perspective, act of terrorism that took place a couple hours ago. So earlier this morning, Russian media put out that Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, as well as his assistant, were killed when an IED detonated in Moscow. They say Kirillov was the head of the NBC protection troops, NBC standing for Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical. Not the TV network, but I understand the confusion. Now, Russia says they've kicked off an investigation. Not a lot new information at this point. Look, honestly, we have video from before, during, and after the attack, which does hint to something that I'll get to here in a second. But in turn, there's nothing really outside of that video footage that we've been able to gather at this point. So Russia says, according to the investigation, on the morning of December 17th, an explosive device was detonated in Moscow, planted in a scooter parked next to the entrance of a residential building. As a result of the incident, Kirillov and his assistant were killed. Now, a couple things, key points here, I think worth mentioning, and we're going to talk about kind of where Russia is pointing this at this point in time. First off, there's been no claims of responsibility. It's understandable that Russia is looking at the Ukrainian GUR, or Main Intelligence Directorate. They have carried out attacks inside of Russia, eliminating senior Russian military officials since the start of the war. It wouldn't be a shock to find out they're the ones behind this. Now, when it comes to those assassinations carried out by the GUR historically, we've seen a wide swath. So we've seen some where they claim responsibility right away and say, we did it, here's why. Other times where they're just completely silent, and it really seems like it was probably the GUR, but they don't actually say anything about it, so kind of open to interpretation. And then a lot that are right in the middle, where they maybe put out some pictures or videos that you could only get if you were actually on scene right about the time that the event took place, but they also don't claim responsibility, kind of suggesting maybe they had a hand in it and helped an operative or an asset inside of Russia to carry out that operation. So we have yet to see if the GUR is going to say anything about this at all. As of this recording, they're completely silent. I've also seen some speculation, accusations, if you will, that the United States must have known about this assassination attempt because we have such a close relationship with Ukraine. Look, for anybody who's been following this war, you know that just a couple months ago, we really started to see a rift between the United States and Ukraine when Ukrainian forces pushed into Kursk. Following the summer offensive of 2023, Ukraine kind of learned their lesson that they don't necessarily benefit by sharing these plans with the United States. One, the U.S. tends to push back and provide a lot of different options that Ukraine might not agree with. But more importantly, we are leaking information left and right. And a lot of the stuff for the summer offensive was known to the Russians before the Ukrainians carried it out. So when the Kursk operation kicked off a couple months ago, U.S. officials appeared completely caught off guard. And when you look at statements from Ukrainian officials, they're saying, yeah, we didn't tell them. Why would we tell them? When we tell them things, the wrong people find out about it before too long. So I would be surprised if Ukraine is sharing anything like sensitive targeting information with the United States as of late. Now, looking at some Russian reactions here that I think are really notable because this is kind of the direction they're going to try to shape the conversation in the coming days, so it's worth trying to get ahead of this. Starting with Rybar, Russian media here, they say, quote, "The war is not somewhere in Donbass. The explosion clearly demonstrates this. You, talking to the Russian people, can't relax at all. The media will now circulate different versions of why it was Kirillov. We are sure someone will try to spin the version about exposing the biolabs." Actually got that here in a second. They say, in reality, everything is much simpler. The enemy dealt with the person he could reach. So the Rybar explanation here is Kirillov was easily accessible. He was a soft target. And if you look at the videos of this attack, it doesn't look like he had any sort of security detachment or security detail. It was him and his assistant. And clearly, the pattern of life was pretty easy to dial in. He was moving to and from the same locations, probably around the same time on the same days, to the point where whoever did this, whether it was GUR or someone else, was able to set up cameras monitoring that location from across the street in a car, which is where some of this footage is coming from, and they knew where to plant the scooter. They knew where to watch for him to come out at a specific time, and they knew where to carry out that strike in a way where, from my understanding at this point, there were 0 civilian casualties. It was 2 military personnel eliminated in this strike. So that kind of tracks with the Rybar assessment at this point of why Kirillov? Because he was a soft target, at least a soft target compared with others inside of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, there's some other assessments floating around out there that I feel like are worth touching on, again, because you're probably going to see these pushed more and more in the coming days. This is one from Russian military blogger Roman Alkine, who says, of course, not only the GUR and SBU of Ukraine participated in the terrorist attack against the head of the NBC protection troops, but also curators from the United States. So shouldn't be a shock, but we are going to start seeing more and more about how this was the United States or the U.S. was behind it or something like that. He says Kirillov exposed the use by the Ukrainian Nazi regime of chemical substances prohibited by international conventions, but also their place of origin, the United States of America. Look, I'm going to be honest. I've been following this war since it began. I don't remember the documented evidence of Ukraine using banned chemical weapons that were provided by the United States, unless Russia's talking about like CS gas, maybe. If that's what they're getting at, sure doesn't seem like that's the suggestion, but either way, they say, in fact, Lieutenant General Kirillov was not posing a threat to Zelensky and the Ukrainian armed forces, which violated all international conventions of warfare, but to their U.S. handlers, and they couldn't stand it, killing him before another briefing. At which time, by the way, at which perhaps he wanted to report on new investigations into the use of chemical and biological agents under U.S. leadership. Again, you're probably going to see this floating around in comment sections and in videos and in social media for the next couple of days. So the idea that he was about to uncover some major plot between the United States and Ukraine to use chemical and biological weapons. I don't know. There's nothing else to suggest that's even in the cards other than random Russian military bloggers. But knowing how this war is gone, you're going to see that popping out here before too long. Now, personal assessment here, I have very mixed feelings about all of this. I understand both points of view on this specific event. I understand when I see Ukrainians and Ukrainian sources celebrating this and saying this is a Russian military official that is taking part in this war against our people and we eliminated him, or he's eliminated, right? I understand that point of view. I get it. I also understand from the Russian perspective where they're saying, hey, this is an act of terrorism. And if this happened anywhere else, you would call it terrorism. And how can the United States, NATO, and Western countries look at their ally and say this is okay for you to set off explosive devices, IEDs, in a major city anywhere in the world? I understand that too. And I understand the Ukrainian point of view. So it's messy. It's complicated. My feelings on this, honestly, are kind of contradictory in a lot of ways. But as of now, no official claims of responsibility, although it does really look like Russia, to nobody's surprise at all here, is looking at Ukrainian GUR specifically. Now, turning to some new footage we have that might be the first indications of North Korean troops actually operating, fighting, and being killed in Ukraine. This is a point of contention now for a couple months. I feel pretty confident at this point in saying that there are North Korean troops in Russia based off of the videos we've seen at training grounds. We had some intercepted calls leaked where there's somebody in that call speaking what appears to be Korean. And then a lot of briefings from Russian military personnel talking about their time training the North Koreans. And they're talking about the pros and the cons. They've talked about how, hey, these guys are professional and they want to be here. They volunteered to go fight. But at the same time, they're having a hard time identifying friend from foe. They think Ukrainians and Russians look alike, which is a problem on the battlefield. And they've also talked a lot about the language barrier being a real issue. So all of that really kind of suggests there really are North Korean troops somewhere in Russia. I feel pretty confident saying that. The question up until possibly right now was, what are they doing? When are they going to actually be utilized in the fight, or are they? Now, just a couple days ago, or yesterday, Pentagon spokesperson Major General Pat Ryder said, quote, "We do assess that North Korean soldiers have engaged in combat in Kursk. We do have indications that they have suffered casualties, both killed and wounded." Also yesterday, U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said several dozen North Korean soldiers had been killed or wounded, and the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, said the North Korean troops had been embedded with Russian Marine and airborne forces that had launched multiple attacks into Kursk. So what we're going to see here, and I'll play a handful of clips so you can kind of judge for yourself, because I don't know. I'm like 90 to 95% sure that what you're seeing here are North Korean soldiers. The problem is, like, what is it going to take to definitively check that box, right? There are Russian soldiers that look Asian that are from Russia, ethnic Russians from certain portions of the country. And we've seen that from the early days of the war. So simply seeing an Asian in a Russian military uniform does not automatically mean North Korean soldier. That said, these clips are kind of interesting. There's a lot of A lot of Asian soldiers in Russian uniforms mixed together, carrying out tactics that we haven't really seen by Russian forces in quite a while. And it does kind of link up with a lot of the official statements just in the last couple of days that, hey, they finally did it. They pushed the North Korean troops into battle. Now we have a statement here from Ukrainian President Zelensky along with a video that he published where he said, quote, even after years of war, when it seems that there can be no greater cynicism from the Russians, we still see something worse. Russia is not only involving North Korean soldiers in assaults on Ukrainian positions, but also trying to hide the losses of these people. There were attempts to keep the presence of soldiers from North Korea a secret. While they were being trained, they were even forbidden to show their faces. The Russian military tried to delete any video evidence of their presence. And now, after the battles with our guys, the Russians are also trying to literally burn the faces of the killed North Korean soldiers. This is a demonstration of the contempt that now reigns in Russia, contempt for everything human. There's no reason for Koreans to fight and die for Putin. And even after their death, all that awaits them from Russia is mockery. This madness must be stopped with a reliable and lasting peace and Russia's responsibility for this cynical war. So again, based off of everything we're seeing here, personal assessment, I'm going to go in like the 90 to 95% certainty that we're seeing North Korean troops actually used in the fighting in Kursk, which brings us to kind of the bigger question of why are they there in the first place? What is this agreement? And we still don't know what North Korea is actually getting out of this. I'd be very interested to figure that out. Might be years before we actually had that information. One of the arguments, however, is that North Korean troops would be used in Kursk because Kursk is inside of Russia, right? It's a whole different argument. Technically, Russia is now having an ally help them push out foreign invaders from their own territory. That's a very different argument on the world stage than moving North Korean soldiers into Ukraine, a foreign territory. So one of the arguments as to why North Korean troops might be used in this way was they could be used in Kursk, and that could allow Russian soldiers to continue pressing all along the front inside of Ukrainian territory. I don't know if that's exactly what played out here, but I should note that over the last few weeks, months, arguably the last year, what we've seen all across the front are slow, steady, but very costly Russian gains. I mean, really, for about a year now, if you remove the Kursk operation where Ukrainian forces moved into and still hold about half of the territory inside of Russia that they once did at the start of the operation, if you take that out, for the last year, essentially all of the progress in the battlefield has been Russia taking Ukrainian territory. Just about every day now for quite a while, I open up Telegram and we see new flag plantings by the Russians in, small settlements and intersections, things that have been long abandoned. In some cases, it's just ruins or maybe a couple buildings. Nothing strategic, nothing overly significant, but every day it's something. Russia is continually advancing in multiple directions, and, for most of this war, it's been pretty stagnant. As of late, it's been relatively constant advances. That's something to consider. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons that we could point to here. One is that Russia, from the start of the war, has had an advantage in firepower, no doubt. They've had an advantage in quantity of equipment. But another one that I think is really worth hammering on here for a second is their advantage in manpower. And there was a good article here that I'm going to run through in Financial Times talking about this a little bit, where they said more Ukrainian soldiers have deserted in the first 10 months of this year than in the previous 2 years of the war combined. Let that sink in for a minute. So desertions in the Ukrainian military are spiking right now. And I think a lot of people might point to different reasons for that to kind of try to justify different aspects of how they feel about the war. What this is going to kind of zero in on is lack of rotation at the front. Let's get into this here. So they say, in a standout case in late October, hundreds of infantry serving in Ukraine's 123rd Brigade abandoned their positions in the eastern town of Volodar. They returned to their homes in the Mykolaiv region, where some staged a rare public protest, demanding more weapons and training. Quote, we arrived in Volodar with just automatic rifles. They said there would be 150 tanks. There were 20, and nothing to cover us, quote, end quote, said an officer from the 123rd Brigade who spoke in the condition of anonymity. They say Ukrainian prosecutors opened 60,000 cases between January and October this year against soldiers for abandoning their positions, almost twice as many as they initiated in 2022 and 2023 combined. If convicted, the men face prison sentences of up to 12 years. And what they're really zeroed in on here is the challenge of rotating troops on and off the battlefield. They say the 123rd Brigade officer told the Financial Times that in the 3 years of war, his unit had not had a single rotation. These would normally consist of 4 weeks in which soldiers return to their base to rest, train with new recruits, and fix damaged equipment. Quote, no one fucking needed Volodar, he said. The town had been reduced to rubble over a year ago, so there's no reason to put his men in harm's way to defend it, he said. Quote, they're just killing them instead of letting them rehabilitate and rest. So that's the officer from the 123rd Brigade. And look, there's an emotional piece to that as well when you're forced to defend and fight in an area that maybe you don't understand or believe in, whatever that might be, right? It's impossible for me to make that assessment from the outside, his exact feelings. But there's also only so much that the human body and mind can actually take, right? Like you can try to prepare yourself for combat, and some people you can never physically and mentally prepare for life in a combat scenario. Like it's just not going to happen. For others, you can, and there's a degree of training you can go through to kind of prepare them for what they might experience on the battlefield. But even then, like there's a limit to how much that will actually work. Like, so imagine, for instance, you have to go sleep outside for a week, right? No creature comforts. And let's say it's even nice conditions. It's not like it is in Ukraine right now where it's actually freezing outside, but it's relatively decent weather. But on top of that, you have no contact with friends or family, no creature comforts. You're at risk of dying a painful death literally at any moment, and your sleep schedule is all off. You're not sleeping 8 hours a night or even 6 hours a night. You're sleeping in like 1 to 2 hour spurts because you're constantly being woken up by enemy artillery and drones. Sometimes the Russians choose to attack and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's an actual attack. Sometimes it's a feint. Sometimes it's a false alarm. So you're constantly awake, down. Your adrenaline is spiking and crashing all day, every day. Imagine that for a week. How much that would wear on you, how much that would just drain you down to hardly being able to do anything. Now make that a month or 3 months, 6 months, a year. How about 3 years? You see how easy it would be for these people to just be broken. And this isn't unique to Ukraine in this war, this is every military in every conflict. So it's not surprising at all that we're seeing troops kind of reach their breaking point. If they can't rotate off the front, can't have any sort of break, like there's only so much they can do to still man that position and actively defend against the Russian assaults. In fact, a U.S. official in Washington said that they wanted Kyiv to lower the recruitment age to 18. Quote, the simple truth is that Ukraine is not currently mobilizing or training enough soldiers to replace their battlefield losses while keeping pace with Russia's growing military, the officer said last week. Now, this is actually a very contentious item in this war. Ukraine has not lowered their conscription age to 18. And a piece of this that I think is often overlooked is that there's a real demographic challenge, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia as well, where there is just quite frankly a shortage of young people. And an argument being made by folks in Ukraine is that if they start conscripting people as young as 18, like that might help in the immediate term with the war, but it risks, eliminating their country in the long term. If their population, 18 to 30 years old, is significantly degraded. And again, this is an issue for Ukraine and Russia. So I can see how you might look at this and say, well, if they both have the same problem, what's the big deal? And in this case, it's comparing one to the other, and Russia's population is 3 to 4 times that of Ukraine. So they just have the ability to hang on to this quite a bit longer. Now, that demographic piece there is a bit longer term, but shifting more to the near term, it does look more and more like both sides are really jockeying for position ahead of Trump coming into office next week, kind of with the expectation that there's going to be some sort of negotiation brought about relatively early on. And this isn't new. From the moment the election ended, we did see both sides kind of start pushing for the upper hand, if you will. In fact, Russian milblogger Fighter Bomber put it well, I think, although kind of dark, a couple days ago, when he said, quote, the next couple months will be very decisive. That is, blood will flow like a river. The main thing is that it is not ours. Now, there's been surprisingly, a lot of talk recently on Russian channels about a possible Ukrainian offensive coming up sometime soon. Now, I'm not seeing this on any Ukrainian channels, even the overly optimistic pro-Ukraine channels talking about this. And there's a couple different ways to interpret that. One is, of course, Ukraine's not going to talk about it. They learned their lesson in the last summer offensive, and ahead of the Kursk operation, nobody was talking about it. It was completely silent on the Ukrainian side. So that's one aspect, and it could very well be coming. It's just, operational security is good. The other side is it's the Russians doom posting and just being overly concerned. We've heard about this for months. When Kursk kicked off, for weeks after that, there were a lot of Russian accounts absolutely terrified that there's about to be some large-scale Ukrainian assault in Zaporozhye. Didn't happen. But they were freaked out for like weeks on end that was right around the corner. So who knows, right? But I've seen enough of this across enough different Russian channels that I felt like it was at least worth highlighting one of the more articulate assessments of this possible coming offensive. And this one's coming from Rybar, where they said, quote, some time ago, thousands of enemy reinforcements, about 13,000 people, were supposed to arrive in the Sumy region. But this group suddenly dissolved, and no large units were noted anywhere else, which suggests that they are somewhere in the rear. In November, December, the number of shots of various armored vehicles being transferred to Ukraine increased across Europe. American Bradleys were seen in Romania, Swedish tracked armored personnel carriers in Germany, and German infantry fighting vehicles and Leopards were noted in Poland. 3 more F-16 fighters flew to Poland from Denmark a few days ago. Their total number varies from 24 to 34, according to different sources. That is, the Ukrainian Air Force has at least a squadron of F-16s, but they are not actually used, but rather preserved. There have also been no strikes by Western missiles for a long time. There are reserves and they are accumulating. Taking all this into account, the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing for an attack. And we think that the main direction will either be Belgorod or Kursk. Now, these regions have been hit by cold weather, meaning the soil will be hard and convenient for armored vehicles to move. Now, there have been a couple more long-range strikes in recent days, but not a lot. So you can kind of understand how each one of those things, if you put them together from the Russian perspective, is wow, something might actually be in the works. And what I'm seeing across a bunch of different Russian Telegram channels are bits and pieces of that. Some pointing to the personnel that were supposed to arrive in certain areas and they're not there. Others, the lack of strikes. Some, the accumulation of Western equipment, or again, where are these F-16s? Why aren't they being utilized? And kind of hinting towards the idea that maybe something's around the corner, and the big date here is coming up in just a few weeks with the Trump inauguration, where he takes office here in the United States, and that's kind of the timeline that a lot of Russian sources are looking at right now. If Ukraine is going to kick something off, it's going to be before that, but time will tell. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.